All right, morning. Happy Friday, fam. Here is your recap on the four strikes of the late 19th century. Uh, First one, Railroad Strike of 1877. Okay, this is going to be the first major strike in American history. And what happens is there's going to be an economic depression that occurs in the 1870s, and in response to that, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad is going to cut their workers' wages by 10%. But they're still going to pay their stockholders 10% dividends, 10% of profits, and it's going to really anger the workers because they weren't making much money anyway. So the strike's going to break out. It's going to last for over a month and a half. They're going to shut down half of the United States Railroad. So, kind of imagine the internet being disrupted greatly by people in a protest. So that's going to lead to riots throughout the country. This is a really, really big deal. Ultimately, in that month and a half, over 100 workers are to be killed. There'll be millions of dollars in damages in 1877 money, which is an incredible amount. In fact, it's going to feel like a revolution on a certain point. And President Rutherford B. Hayes is going to send troops to put the strike down. So this will be the first time that U.S. troops are used for something like this. And of course, they're going to intervene on the side of big business if they put the strike down. This is going to lead to the general public being scared of a revolution because they fear an uprising of the working class. The next strike, or protest, but it's about labor, so it's the Haymarket Affair. The Haymarket Affair is going to occur in Chicago, Illinois, and basically what happens is the workers at the McCormick Harvesting Company are going to go on strike. And the company's going to hire some replacement workers, and they're called scabs. And when the scabs show up to work, the striking workers and the scabs are going to get into kind of a violent confrontation, and there's going to be some problems. The police will show up, and they're going to shoot in the crowd, and they're going to kill a striker. So the next day, some anarchists are going to organize a protest at Haymarket Square, and that's where it gets its name. And they're going to show up, and they're going to have a peaceful protest where they're going to complain, and demand changes for police brutality and for working conditions, those kinds of things. In fact, the mayor of Chicago will even be there to speak, and he's going to remark later that it was a very peaceful protest, but then the police show up to break up the protest. Someone someplace throws a bomb. We're not exactly sure who did it, but think it was probably an anarchist, and shots will ring out then after that. Several protesters and police die before it's all over. What happens is this is really going to hurt the union movement because people don't like anarchists. Anarchists believe in overthrowing the government. They don't want any government. Really, they don't want our government, but because the anarchists are now associated with the union movement, the public is going to be fearful of anarchists, and it's going to hurt the union movement, and it's going to really cement that relationship between unions and anarchists in the public's mind. Next one is the Homestead Strike in Pennsylvania, and this is one of Andrew Carnegie's steel plants in Homestead, Pennsylvania. And what happens is Carnegie is trying to make more money. The economy isn't great. And he wants to become the richest man in the world. But the problem is Carnegie's too nice of a guy. So he hires a jerk to run his plant, and that jerk's name is Henry Frick. And Frick is going to be the guy that kind of drives the workers harder and harder and harder, makes them work longer, starts cutting their wages, all of that stuff. And eventually the workers will go out on strike, and Henry Frick causes that. Well, what Frick is going to do is he's going to hire the Pinkerton Detectives, which is like a private army or a private militia, to come in and break up the strike because the strikers have surrounded the plant and aren't letting anybody through. So when the Pinkertons come in, then they're going to arrive on barges on the river, and they come into Homestead. They're basically going to march to the plant and confront the strikers, and someone's going to fire a shot. Again, we're not really sure who, but everybody starts shooting, and what's going to ultimately happen is 9 of the strikers are going to be killed, but they're going to drive the Pinkertons back to the river. The Pinkertons are actually going to get on their barges and float back down the river. And the strikers will actually find some other barges, light them on fire, and send them down the river after the Pinkertons trying to burn their barges. But the governor of Pennsylvania is going to send in the state militia to keep the peace or to maintain the peace or to reset the peace. And And it's another black eye for the union movement, and this will mean that the union will be kept out of the steel plant for over 40 years, so it won't be until the 1930s, during the height of the Great Depression, when that plant will finally become unionized. The last strike we'll talk about then is the Pullman strike. The Pullman Company is a company that makes train cars, and it's a really high-end rail car mostly. So when the economy goes in the tank in the 1890s, rich people stop buying Pullman cars because that's an expense they don't really need to have. So the problem though is that Pullman is a company town, and a company town is a town where the company owns everything. It owns the houses that they live in, and they charge the employees rent for it. It owns the general store where the employees can go buy their stuff. It owns the recreation facilities like the YMCA or the pool halls or whatever, and they charge the residents to use those things. The problem, though, is that Pullman doesn't really pay their employees typically in cash. They pay them in script, in coupons, essentially, that are only good at the company store or the company YMCA or to rent company houses. So when the economy goes in the tank, Pullman is going to cut wages by 25%. So the workers are now making 25%, 1/4 less than they did before, but the company does not drop the price of the rent or the price of their groceries or anything else. So the workers are kind of getting it both ways. So the workers are really angry, and you can understand why. They go on strike, and this strike will spread across the country because we're talking the 1890s. Mail service is on railroads, and that's going to be disrupted by the strike, which means that President Grover Cleveland, giggle Grover, he's going to send troops in to break up the strike, and his rationale is the strike is now disrupting the movement of mail, which is a federal responsibility, so therefore we should send troops in to put the strike down. Okay, so there's your fourth strike. Now here's the common themes, and these are the things I really want you to think about, is that throughout these strikes, government always steps in on the side of big business, and the government sometimes is the president, sometimes it's the army, sometimes it's the local police department or the state militia from the governor, but the government is always stepping in on the side of big business. This is not laissez-faire. This is not hands-off business. This is government being very active, but being active on the side of the business owners and not the workers. Okay, strikes are usually violent in the 19th century. There's often many deaths. And along with those deaths, the workers are going to lose every time. Big business owners are going to win. And throughout all of this, the public grows very fearful of worker uprisings, because what they see in the newspapers typically is that there's a riot and that people die, and they don't maybe necessarily understand why the workers were striking. All they know is that they were really angry, they grabbed some guns, and people are now dead. The final judgment on you, not really a judgment, but the kind of the final takeaways for unions. They did get some small victories. Okay, they're not very big, but they are something, right? At least a start. They did get generally small wage increases. This is not going to create a middle class from the working class, but they do make a little bit more money, so things are a little better. They get a slight reduction in hours per week. So before this era, the average worker would work 54 hours per week, and by the end of this, the labor era that we've talked about, they're down to 49 hours, so 5 fewer hours per week. So remember that 49 hours per week is the new average, and that's down slightly. Maybe the big takeaway is collective bargaining, and that's just a fancy way of saying that workers have the right to negotiate with owners as a group. So you would have a few people go to the owners and negotiate wages or hours for the entire factory, and that's a really big deal. In fact, it's the biggest gain of unions at the time. So hopefully this quick primer about labor unions, or at least the 4 big strikes in the 19th century, will help. If you have any questions, be sure to ask your teacher. All right, thanks, fam. Talk to you soon.